When I start a series, the hope is to learn something new, to grow as an artist. I think a lot about anthropology in my work. By erecting these kind of objects, I'm embedding the story into the skin or the surface of this object. When I think about residual trauma, I think about what's still lingering in my body. What is something that I feel unresolved about, or what's something that I can locate and understand? For me, it's about processing feelings or histories that don't necessarily have language attached to it. When I'm making a sculpture, I'm often really relating it to the body. There's a bit of a choreography of me bending down, kneeling up, being through the work. The sculpture is kind of dancing. The works can be super whimsical, and so the hands that I incorporate in a work is a way to bring it back to a human experience. I'm Kim Garcia. I am an artist that works across sculpture, drawing, and painting. My work fuses fiction and reality to explore influence and intimacy that arise from social interactions, often really inspired by real experiences. And I think of fiction and reality as like a more rounded approach to archiving personal history. I realized all of my interests in these kind of power dynamics and social dynamics were coming from how I was raised. I've been interested in thinking about my identity as a second-generation Filipino American and how that impacts how I navigate the world. Collaboration for me is a place that has a potential. In choosing to make work about my family, I'm being this kind of vehicle to generate this conversation. The She Haunts series is really rooted in thinking about my mom's personal folklore about these magical creatures that live in the Philippine forest and the trees, who are our ancestors. This narrative was like this very powerful narrative that my mom was using to talk about certain traits in our family that me and my brother used to be very embarrassed about. When I first started this series, I was really interested in getting to know a little bit about our family history, also pre-colonial folklore. The more she talked about the story, it changed. I was very frustrated with that, but I was like, maybe that's the whole point. It's these different perspectives of oral narrative that changes every time it's retold. That's kind of been a staple for my practice. My parents live in San Diego and I'm in LA, and so I'll visit and then I will record through my iPhone, just any simple recording. I've had my mom type it out, which is another way of performing. Sometimes we'll try to make objects together, and I think of that as a type of recording. She's talking about the story and then transforming it into a material. We'll talk on the phone and I'll draw, and then that will be a type of recording. I was recently given the opportunity to do an exhibition at Phase Gallery in Los Angeles, and I used that kind of as a way of culminating the series. The name Smoking in the Garden comes from my mom's maiden name, which is my middle name, Fumar. And the garden is this kind of private landscape of what I like to think of as the Philippines. When I first started the series, she had shifted her narrative even more, and it became more of her childhood story growing up. And I realized that the narrative ended up being this kind of platform for her processing her trauma and kind of this search for meaning and belonging within her name, the Fumar name. And at the same time, me just understanding her more. There's a lot of power dynamics that happen in her search for her identity, and then realizing how that's influenced me as well. Rather than focusing on the narrative or illustrating that in a certain way, the work became about healing that narrative or healing moments from that narrative in our relationship. It's like a merge of our stories together. Even thinking about the Fumar name as this kind of smoke that could purify and heal, but also knowing that it can harm at the same time. So really thinking about the duality of that relationship. For me, the work was really about now seeing how it can facilitate healing rather than the narrative itself. Me being able to identify the trauma that she's speaking about and then enter gently into being able to let her speak what she wants to say and letting that narrative kind of transform the way that I'm going to talk about the work. Leaving space for her to process in our very intimate and personal archives is kind of like paying a tribute to the ancestor, the story, almost like a spell or like a prayer to this point in her life. I think of our relationship abstractly as something that will always circulate and grow. Because I'm working with very personal content, I like to keep elements private. One, to protect the people who are contributing to the conversation or the story, but also to have an element that's for me in the making process. Even though I'm not making it very clear to me, I'm recording that on a personal level, and getting those different histories is really important because I don't think that they're necessarily talked about as much. The way that I'm archiving it myself, it feels very important to keep that private thing, and I can pass it down in conversation. I don't really feel like my work is a document in that way. I like thinking about it as a different way of transcribing an archive through the objects emitting the story.